Okay, right. The live stream has started. So first of all, welcome everyone who is here with us in person today for the seminar. Welcome to our online audience who will be joining us. We have a number of people who have registered to watch the seminar live because we are broadcasting it on our YouTube channel and we're also recording it there so that other people can see the recording if they cannot join us live today. I'm Heiko Balster, I'm director of the Institute for Environmental Futures at the University of Leicester. And I've actually just come back from the climate conference COP28 yesterday, so I'm still a bit jet-lagged. But what better day than today to have a seminar by Professor John Berry from the Queen's University Belfast, who has worked for many years on the green economy, political economy, and the climate crisis and related issues. Today is actually the last day, supposedly, of the negotiations of the climate agreement at COP28. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you, John, what your perspective is on the climate crisis. And with that, I want to hand over to you if you want to share your screen.
So can you see that okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, listen, good afternoon, colleagues, and thanks very much for the invitation. But before I get into the topic of my talk today, which is made more relevant and poignant because of the ongoing inquiry into how the UK government responded to the crisis. And in fact, the outcomes of that inquiry might make me change some of the things I'll say to you this afternoon. But also just in terms of what Heiko was talking about in terms of what's going on in COP28, which, many of us feel very uncomfortable with having an oil executive as the president of the COP. There's been many analogies being used in terms of it's like inviting an arsonist to chair a firefighters conference or the CEO of a cigarette company to chair a medical conference on cancer. But also there's very worrying signs now that particularly Saudi Arabia and other oil producing states, and obviously the fact that, as many of you probably know, the single biggest delegation at COP28 is not from any national delegation, but actually the fossil fuel industry. But I think on the positive side, again, many of you probably know already, is that it looks like the EU and the US are not very happy with the withdrawal of the phasing out of fossil fuels in the text as opposed to phasing down. And there's also some interesting developments just that caught my eye. One rather negative, which has happened in the past couple of hours, where it looks like the UK Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero has left the conference and come back to the UK to take part in the vote on the Rwanda policy. But on the other side, you've got, oil-rich states like Colombia, which I think is the fifth largest producer of coal and oil. It has signed a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Now, not other big oil company or oil countries have, but I think we're beginning to see it's kind of the first time I can remember where fossil fuels are now front and center of how we deal with the climate crisis. Because even in the much lauded Paris 2015 agreement, fossil fuels is not mentioned once in that entire declaration and treaty. Whereas at least now we begin to see that this is the issue facing how we tackle the climate and the ecological emergency as well, which we often forget. There's a nature crisis as well as a climate crisis. So again, just some casual thoughts on what's happening over in COP. I want to cast your minds back now to a couple of years ago, BC, before COVID, as it were, where our lives were a lot less online. I think we were probably working as home as much and so on. But what I want to offer is some observations in terms of what I sadly think have been lost lessons. Not completely, but I do think a lot of the promise of things like building back better, as we come out of the crisis of COVID, that we would lay down the infrastructure for a low carbon, climate resilient transition, not all of which have been abandoned. But I think a lot of the promise, I think, has certainly evaporated. Doesn't mean to say that it's still not possible to recover it. So I'm going to talk about, some of the issues that I think we might be able to learn from reflecting upon how states and societies responded to the COVID pandemic. by beginning, but this is BC, before COVID, many jurisdictions, led off by the British Parliament actually in May 2019, declared a climate and biodiversity crisis. Although it's contested, I think it was partly on the back of the successful media and disruptive tactics of Extinction Rebellion, for example, which, if you recall, were engaged in quite a high level of mobilisation and closing down London and so on. But it began a flurry of other parliaments and jurisdictions also declaring climate and ecological emergency. So that's the one that started things off in May 2019 in the UK. A week later, the Irish Parliament also declared a climate and ecological emergency. And many of you are probably living in local authority areas that have also declared climate and ecological emergencies. But of course, the issue is if it's rhetoric or reality in terms of WTF. We're all living in, even the Northern Ireland Assembly has declared an emergency, the UK Parliament, many of our local authorities. But how do we know our lives are any different because we're now living in jurisdictions that have declared a climate emergency? And I think this is really important because for our citizens, they read that and, local politicians are saying, yes, we declare a climate and ecological emergency, but then nothing happens. And it's not unreasonable then for our citizens to say, well, it mustn't really be an emergency because surely that's how, we would react in a different way rather than essentially business as usual continuing. Our lives aren't appreciably any different because of these declarations. And I think it cheapens this idea that we are in an emergency. And what's interesting here is, when you look at the Irish case, and again, I don't know the case in the British Parliament, but I want to draw your attention to, yes, the Parliament declared an emergency, but just 6 of the 168 TDs are equivalent of MPs. Only 6 TDs were in the chamber when we declared this emergency. So how serious is it? Don't get me wrong, I think there's still value to be had even in these rhetorical commitments and declarations, but it does make me more skeptical. We should all be skeptical of politicians declaring these emergencies and then not doing anything about it. Whereas actually, to get to the main point I want to share with you today, the pandemic, that's what a real emergency looks like. Where we began to see very serious action by the state, working from home, washing our hands, social distancing, a lot of changes in our lives and livelihoods as a result of that public health emergency. And we don't see anything like the scale and urgency of the changes when it comes to the ecological and climate crisis. And of course, we have to ask ourselves, why? Why is this the case? And actually, I began thinking on these terms quite early on in the pandemic. I wrote a report for a small green think tank called Greenhouse in terms of already I could see within the first couple of weeks of how the pandemic was being responded to particularly by the state, beginning to think, well, is this kind of almost like exercising a muscle that may be needed as we deal with the climate and ecological crisis? I put up this quote because I do, even though I've got some difficulties with some of the tactics of Extinction Rebellion, I do like their clear-headed view that, they have 3 demands, and the first demand is tell the truth. And I think, in my own view, 1.5 as the goal is dead. And indeed, if you're interested, James Hansen, the NASA climate scientist, very prominent in terms of being an activist and a scholar in climate science, he and his colleagues have produced a paper just on the 7th of December, which is basically saying that, yes, absolutely 1.5 is dead. And actually 2 degrees now probably looks more likely as the next goal to aim for. And we need to be honest with our citizens. And that's why I use this quote here from James Baldwin in the sense of, it's not to frighten people, but I think we have to be honest with people that it's worse than they think. I think we make it into this. I think there's also then too much of what I would call happy clappy techno optimism, that somehow we can find a way of using carbon capture sequestration or negative emissions technologies or solar radiation and geoengineering techniques as a way of solving the crisis. And I think that's very risky and dangerous and has very little empirical plausibility even though it has a lot of political and ideological comfort, particularly for politicians and interests that want to preserve the status quo. And again, to see how what the pandemic and indeed the climate crisis both contain elements of what somebody that I would be completely diametrically the opposite of in terms of ideologically, Milton Friedman, you know, part of the new right or neoliberalism that we have been living in many countries for the last 40 years or so. I think what he says here is quite correct in terms of a crisis again being an opportunity. And even how in the pandemic, particularly state-led responses, which could be called socialist in terms of parts of our economy being at least coordinated, if not directly controlled by the state, which would be unthinkable, you know, a couple of months before the pandemic, now not only became possible, but absolutely necessary. And many countries around the world engaged, particularly in Europe, in very direct state involvement in mobilizing the resources of the economy, obviously, particularly around the development of a vaccine and so on. And then in some countries, there was a temporary socialization of even private medical resources, certainly in Ireland and Spain. And then the government paid private companies for this. But you can begin to see in the context of a crisis, the free market is not necessarily the go-to solution. It really is about states and societies coming to a new social contract or social agreement around how to deal with this particular emergency. And that may be something we want to talk about in terms of what might that look like in the context if you got really serious about treating the climate and ecological crisis as such. I think there are a number of lessons, but I'm just going to basically talk about three in terms of looking at the causes of the pandemic. And there are lessons in for us in understanding, like, what are the root causes of the climate and ecological crisis? And in case I don't get to it, it isn't just the burning of carbon, it's the reasons why we're burning carbon. And for me, they lie in the structure of a capitalist growth-based economy, certain that an economy that in the global north has now passed the threshold where it's actually healthy and is actually adding more benefits than causing problems and risks in our society. So look at the political economy root causes rather than just simply looking at emissions and the energy system. Is actually say, well, how's the energy system connected then to the political economy and economic system? Then there's lessons we can learn from how do we cope, because I don't think we can perhaps solve the climate crisis or even solve the pandemic, because we're still living with the pandemic, but that issue of adaptation and I think solving and coping mechanisms are not necessarily always the same in terms of, you know, trying to deal with these issues in a verifiably empirical and scientifically credible way. Is that we're going to have to live in an inevitably climate changed world and a much more ecologically destabilized world, even if we were to stop burning all fossil fuels and do radical changes, like, you know, Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, you know, says that, you know, when he reads the IPCC reports, it's about changing everything everywhere all at once. Even if we were to do all of that, we would still live, at least for decades ahead, in a climate changed and ecologically destabilized world. So adaptation, I think, is going to be so important in the years and decades ahead. And then, of course, how we recover. And as I said, my own sense is that a lot of the promise of a green, low carbon, climate resilient recovery, I think, have been largely squandered. Not completely, but I think a lot of the potential have been lost due to things like, you know, politics. I think if Jeremy Corbyn had been elected rather than Boris Johnson, you know, particularly under the shadow chancellor as of then, John McDonnell, there was a very ambitious kind of Green New Deal, ambitions for large-scale battery factories in Britain, you know, rolling out of renewable energy, the creation of, unionized green jobs and so on, which I think could have delivered for Britain and the UK as a whole a very different state post-Brexit than we now experience. But again, people can, question that. So I think the vagaries of liberal democratic politics also robbed us coming out of the pandemic in a different way, rather than what I see in most states was a return to the status quo ante, a return back to the way things were before COVID, in that very conservative understanding of resilience. Like we bounce back to a previous state, rather than seeing it as transformative in terms of, bouncing forward and into a different configuration of our economies and societies. So this was doing the rounds at least 2 years ago, and some of you may have seen it. We fight the virus as a way then, and the bigger challenge, of course, then is the climate issue. And I do think that even despite my disappointment in a way that a lot of the promise of a green recovery perhaps hasn't come true, there is still some evidence that particularly a large state or a much more interventionist state may be with us for some time to come. And that's no bad thing, in my view. Purely functionally, there are ideological reasons you can say that a more active state managing and coordinating the economy is good for a lot of reasons, equity reasons and so on, which I still would agree with. I now think we're coming to the point where, for functional scientific reasons, we are going to need to start looking at a more interventionist, democratized, and maybe even decentralized state, connecting with our local communities as a way of effectively responding to the climate and ecological crisis. And I like this quote, again, a bit like Milton Friedman. They wouldn't be particularly ideological bedfellows of mine. Warren Buffett is a very well-known venture capitalist and promoter, obviously, of a free market capitalist view of the world. But he did, point out something that I think, and I don't know whether he said this during the pandemic or this is something he'd said before, but in a way, the pandemic revealed a lot of problems in our society. Not that they weren't there before, but I think it brought them into sharp relief. The inequality, issues around who's a core and essential worker and who isn't, just to be, provocative, just to give you the image, which was more important during the pandemic. Somebody speculating on the City of London Stock Exchange, pressing buttons to make in fractions of a second, hundreds of thousands of pounds by speculating on currency exchange rates, or a nurse. And of course, the difference is stark in terms of who's paid more, who has more social status in our society. And again, it did raise those issues. But I think, yes, for a time, I think people were thinking along these lines, but I don't think we're still in that state now. Although, again, we can discuss and see whether or not there's still a resonance, as it were, of revealing what is the core economy. It's the people who make your food, who keep the lights on, who lift your bins, who keep our society going in terms of its basic goods and services, and not necessarily currency speculators. And I say that partly for ideological reasons. I think there are many reasons why we should be viewing such jobs like currency speculation as actually socially destructive and not actually adding to our well-being in society, and valuing more those professions that are actually adding to preserving life and enhancing well-being, including mental health in our society. So I think, as I mentioned, I think the pandemic, on the back of the kind of the Buffett quote, it revealed a lot of weaknesses in our societies, and particularly the precarious nature, including in the academy, where many of you are either working or studying. We tend to forget, for those particularly in professional or senior professorial positions, you kind of often forget, to my shame, about how much of the work that goes on in my own university is actually precarious. Often paid by people who aren't able to, make ends meet, and so on. So it's not like the academy is a kind of a paragon of well-paid employment. It isn't. But this is cascaded right throughout society in terms of a very evocative phrase that Naomi Klein, the Canadian author and activist, has termed, currently we have a dig and gig economy. And what she means by that, we have an extractivist, ecocidal and suboptimal ecological linear extractivist economy, but it's also based on a gig economy in terms of precarious, low-paid, 0 hours, non-unionized labor. And the pandemic really brought that to the fore in some ways. Whereas what we need to do, and the pandemic promised to come back out of this in this manner, and it still might be there, to move from the dig and gig economy to a care and repair one, to actually see that part of our recovery of creating a new economy that's fit for purpose for the 21st century is to start valuing the unpaid work of mostly women in our societies that are doing a lot of the caring responsibility. Care work is work. but it doesn't carry the same status and certainly is not included in our GDP figures. But also then repair. We have to repair particularly a lot of damaged ecosystems, which is also a formal job employment creation opportunity. So it's a nice phrase in encapsulating a complex issue of the digging gig, our unsustainable and frankly unjust current economic arrangement that's also unsustainable, to a care and repair of some low carbon, different type of economy where we're moving away from metrics purely based on monetizing activities, but also, valuing the quality of life and well-being, including, as I say, mental health, rather than just looking at the monetary transactions that happen in a society as measured by GDP. And again, just to make a point that was actually made to me by a German colleague during the pandemic, in terms of, remember every Thursday we all stood outside our houses and we banged pots or we clapped for our healthcare workers. But as my German colleague said, why don't you just pay them properly? What good is clapping, even though it was a great gesture of solidarity? And it's a true point. I mean, this is a nice funny story that came up, again from 2 years ago, of a nurse, imagining a nurse paying for her shopping with claps, given how often low paid and stressed these vital workers actually are. But also the pandemic revealed the fact that we, could have this opportunity to rethink and reset. I mean, again, it's that argument that a crisis is an opportunity to rethink and to recreate, including not just the pandemic or indeed the ecological and climate crisis as not just a threat. It's actually an opportunity to, reconfigure and rewire our economies and societies. But in the same way, the Second World War in many European countries, Britain not least, in terms of laying down the foundations of the welfare state, which of course has been tragically degraded over the last number of years since it was founded. But the sense in which, big upheavals as an opportunity to actually reconfigure our economies and societies. And particularly, and this is partly reflecting on, I suppose, my own personal experience of the pandemic, and that may resonate with some of you there, but also some academic research that was done of people feeling that sense of vulnerability, but also the interconnectedness that, people getting to know their neighbours and, more fit and mobile members of our communities looking in on the frail and the elderly. There was a genuine sense of solidarity, even what's it called? I forget the name of the online platform that I joined and still am a member of, neighborhood, where people were able to connect using the online system, as well as, of course, speaking across their garden fences and so on. But that sense of vulnerability and solidarity, I think, did come out during the pandemic. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we saw what works, or what forms of work really matter, and what workers were essential, and the core economy was revealed. But then there was this issue, particularly that was our political leaders' mantra. We're kind of all in this together, in terms of, yes, an appeal to national solidarity of coming together to fight the virus and this public health scare. But the reality was that we weren't all in this together, that, we could see racial, gender, class, income, even spatial and geographical inequalities, which became more apparent in terms of even globally, where we had essentially vaccine nationalism, that many of us in the global north, we could have 2 or 3 vaccinations before, the majority of the human family even had one in parts of Africa and Asia, and so on. So there was definite questions around this idea that we're all in this together, or indeed, again, to go back to reflections on those workers in the health profession, in terms of, a lot of them were sacrificed. And I think probably the COVID inquiry hopefully will bring out not just the fact that, I think, again, I could be wrong, but it's going to turn out that we perhaps sacrificed our care homes because there's so much attention on, bending the curve down and trying to stop the peak from overwhelming our healthcare system, that, it was either by default or by, trying to work out the best solution. But I think a lot of our older community unnecessarily died as a result of that decision being made to focus too much on the frontline healthcare system and not enough then on our care homes. And again, just to be provocative and to give you a bit of an Irish flavour of my view, in Ireland we have this kind of statement or slogan around the Great Famine. We had a Great Famine in Ireland in the mid 19th century on Gorta Moor, as it is Oscailga in Irish, the Great Hunger. And it's this phrase, John Mitchell was a very famous political agitator at the time. This, you can see there what he says: the Almighty sent the potato blight, but actually the English created the famine. In other words, and it kind of prefigured or anticipated the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, who some of you may know or know his work. And in his great essay, Famine, Affluence and Morality, he basically argues, and I paraphrase here, that famine is not the absence of food. It's the absence of the capacity to buy food. And of course, this is contested even in Ireland. But the argument being that there was plenty of food in Ireland, even during the potato famine, but the food was being shipped back to England for export. So the famine, in a way, was socially and politically, if not created, then certainly exacerbated. Well, I've made the equally provocative view that I do think you could see the pandemic as a result of the ways in which global capitalism has been developing over the last number of decades, encroaching into wilderness areas, releasing pathogens that human beings haven't come up against, and therefore causing the crisis of the pandemic. But in a way, the virus escaped as a result of global capitalism, but the responses of national capitalisms, you could say, caused the pandemic. Now, again, it might just be it's a trite phrase and doesn't actually read over in the same way that it might do with the famine. But it's that idea that we must always bear in mind that whatever is natural is very rarely natural. Even earthquakes and the impacts of that depends upon the political, economic governance systems that are operand at that time. So it's always bringing in the fact that we're talking about socio-natural, phenomena and crises, and be always having our antennae about, well, what's the politics here? Who's in power? In whose interest is it to have that response to this natural crisis rather than another? So some of the lessons I think we can learn from the crisis, and I've mentioned these in passing, we found that states, despite 40 years of neoliberalism telling us the market is the only effective way to manage our economies and deliver benefits and goods and services to our communities, you really see that what happens in a crisis is you need resource mobilization very quickly, and for that you need states or state-like bodies at national, international, and local level. We also learned that finance can be found. Despite Mrs. May, former Theresa May PM, ridiculing those who said that somehow a magic money tree that we can spend on things that we need, we found we could find the money. It's that old question that many of you probably heard a version of over the years. Why is there always money for war and not for our NHS? Why could we bail out the banks in 2008, 2009 across the world, but then we couldn't, fix our societies to make them less unequal or fix our infrastructure and so on? Again, it's that issue. This is a political choice. And I could give you a separate paper on why, particularly in a country that has its own sovereign currency like the UK, the issue is not the lack of money. The real constraint on the economy is the actual resources that are available, not the money itself. And the same goes for other countries like America and Australia and so on. And it's called, if you're interested, modern monetary theory, in terms of the way central banks unduly constrain themselves by saying, oh, the state is like a household. We have to either borrow or raise taxes. We need neither of these, actually, in terms of what states can do. The state issues money directly into existence to mobilize resources. And I go back to that point. What really matters, particularly in the context of responding to a crisis like the pandemic, or even more so in responding to the crisis of the climate and ecological emergency, is the actual resources available in society, not necessarily the money. And we found that populations can adapt, sometimes begrudgingly, but there was a great outpouring of solidarity from people who realized the clear and present danger that the pandemic presented. and did, work from home, wash their hands, social distance, wear masks, and so on the advice of the epidemiological and medical evidence that was being provided to us. And we did see, as I say, forms of solidarity and collective self-help. Yes, there was panic and fear as well, and some resistance, not just in America, where you had a lot of anti-vaxxers being often fired up by Donald Trump, but also in countries like, Germany, for example, or even here in Belfast, we had demonstrations of people who, very small now, I have to say. But, I'm not saying that everybody responded in this spirit of solidarity. And we also found, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, effective communication to communicate and talk about, complex issues. So remember this on the left was this flattening the curve that we were all asked to do. We were doing all these things to try and, stop our healthcare systems being overrun. Well, why can't we use a similar visual representation and have this as a weekly bulletin at the BBC or UTV or ITV or whatever the news agency we're thinking of, in the same way that we had this kind of image during the pandemic, that, so we could track changes, how many infections and where we're reaching the capacity of our healthcare system. Why don't we have something similar about bending the greenhouse gas emission curves down so that we know how is Britain doing, for example, on its path to net zero by 2050? But also, why aren't we seeing this in terms of inequality, gender and class and racial inequality as well? You can use a similar way of communicating complex issues, or indeed, and the reason why I put energy poverty there, because it's a particular problem here in Northern Ireland, particularly in Belfast, where we have some of the worst insulated houses probably in Europe, coupled with the fact that we're unusually dependent for oil for space heating, which is a very volatile commodity. And with low wages, you have then a trifecta. So you get low wages, oil dependence for space heating, and then badly insulated houses. And we have an inordinate numbers of our community in energy poverty, which is defined as spending more than 10% of your income just to stay warm. And you can imagine how the skyrocketing costs of gas and oil in particular has impacted and sent people over into even more energy poverty, particularly at a time when the weather is getting cold. So some of the other lessons, I think science and expert knowledge unevenly, as we can see, it looks like the then Chancellor, now Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, didn't think he needed medical or expert advice about his eat out to help out, which of course was eat out to help out the virus in terms of the contagion when people get together. But there was, on the whole, a science-led response. Obviously, it was politically interpreted, and there was a kind of a tussle between the politics and the science, particularly around the keeping the economy open and so on, which you can see being played out, I think, in the COVID inquiry. But then that issue I mentioned a moment ago, once impossible policies, things like universal basic income. Well, a form of universal basic income was basically introduced in Spain, so it was not just a furlough scheme of paying either the full 100% or 80% of a worker's wage to stay at home. But even in Spain, this has now been continued post-pandemic. So UBI, universal basic income, has been, on the more radical end of policy proposals for the last number of decades. And we could see that at least during the pandemic in most countries, a version of kind of universal basic income was imposed or offered to certain categories of workers who, could stay at home rather than risk spreading the virus for going into work. But obviously positive, environmental and climate impacts, on the anecdotal level, which many of us experience, not hearing airplanes in the sky, being able to hear birdsong because there was not that much traffic on the roads, reconnecting with local green and blue spaces if you were lucky enough to live in near a park or a river or the seaside. And again, that issue of the inequality. If you were a single mom living in a high-rise flat in London, the pandemic was a very different experience than those of us who are living in leafy suburbs and so on. So again, that issue of the pandemic really brought out some of those inequalities, but it did have some positive impacts. Many of us remember seeing the images that, in places like Venice, because there was no tourists going there, that once polluted marine environment began to see the recovery of nature very, very quickly when human beings are not, polluting it and so on. And also then we had a temporary blip in greenhouse gas emissions globally. But even the pandemic wasn't enough to bring down greenhouse gas emissions enough in terms of setting us on a path to keep us below at least 2 degrees global average heating. And of course, there were serious economic impacts. Particularly many businesses found themselves not to be resilient. Particularly in the retail sector, a lot of businesses here in Belfast went to the wall, as happened in many parts of the UK. But then again, other businesses developed in terms of being able to respond to the new opportunities that were available in terms of, delivering to people's houses and so on. But I think on the whole, it was negative. I'm not trying to make it out that there was a balance here. It definitely did have a negative impact economically. But given all of this, states can respond, the money can be found, science can lead our response. Does it give us hope for how we tackle the planetary emergency? Well, not if Trump had anything to do with it, given that at some point during the pandemic, he was encouraging people to, drink bleach as a way of getting rid of the virus and so on. So that's what I mean by the science-led response was extremely uneven. Bad and all as it was, perhaps in the UK, in terms of the economy winning out, these awful discourses within the cabinet of let older people die for the economy to go on. I think it pales into significance in terms of what the Trump administration was doing in terms of denying the reality of the virus and proposing these, frankly, batshit crazy and very dangerous ways of dealing with it. But there are differences just to begin to wind up between the pandemic and the climate and ecological crisis. The virus had, sadly, for many of us, none of us were untouched in terms of knowing people, hopefully not people in our immediate family, but sadly for many of us it was. We knew people were getting ill. Sadly, some people who died who are already immuno and, in a respiratory manner, probably already compromised. We now have people, I certainly know, that are suffering from long COVID and so on. So we could see the direct impacts of the virus immediately all around us. And we don't see often the impact of the negative impacts of the climate crisis. I think this is changing, though. I mean, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but certainly in Ireland now, we've had some devastating floods. The flooding is not caused by the climate crisis, but the flooding is exacerbated as a result of the energy that's now in the climate system. And it's in keeping with the climate prediction, certainly for Ireland, that we're going to have, much more wetter monsoon-like, precipitation events. And even this year, we've had millions of pounds worth of damage to many of our towns and cities as a result of the floods, frankly, because our infrastructure isn't set up to deal with this kind of very, very heavy downpours. But also, and it's particularly resonant in Ireland because of its symbolic as well as its nutritional and dietary value, but the potato crop. They reckon this year that up to a quarter of our potato crop has been affected because farmers just been able to, harvest them and they're just rotting in the ground. And this is going to cause a direct impact on prices and so on. So it might be that this issue is now changing, that people are now beginning to see, maybe not directly or as clearly as I'd like to see them understand that the flooding event in their small town is connected to the climate crisis. The climate crisis is not something that's going to happen in the future or only happen to people in the global south. But I still think that's where a lot of people are at, that climate change is something that is not here right now, but actually is happening in the future or happening to other people elsewhere. The second difference, and this is very pertinent, Piggy, given my opening remarks about the fossil fuel interests at COP28, is that, there isn't anyone pushing for the continuation of the pandemic. But we do have the fossil fuel industry that is pushing for the continuation of the use of fossil fuels, which is going to only exacerbate the climate and ecological crisis, not least, as I say, at the world's titular climate meetings at the conference of the parties like COP28. Again, I couldn't find in time information about how many delegates from the fossil fuel industry was in COP 2028, but this is from the European Union. You just begin to see how much money is being spent by all of these companies there at the bottom. and promoting and often greenwashing themselves as presenting themselves as part of the solution. Just as an aside, I actually think we need more research and investigation into reframing fossil fuels as fossil resources. Because with a fuel you burn, and that's part of the problem, it causes, carbon dioxide emissions. But are there non-fuel, non-energy uses for coal, oil, and gas that we can still use the resource, but not actually in a way that's going to cause these problems? And again, that's not my area of expertise, but I do think there's something in saying, well, is there another way we can use these resources without actually causing the climate and ecological issues that we are now experiencing? And then there was, an uneven listening to the science, a science-led epidemiological response. But when it came to the climate crisis, I mean, we've known for decades in terms of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there's an old report now from 2018, clearly saying we need unprecedented changes across every aspect of our society. Or to use that phrase Antonio Guterres took from the movie, everything, everywhere, all at once. I don't think our communities are fully cognizant of the radical changes that are going to be needed in terms of how we heat, how we eat, how we transport in the years ahead, including the electrification of most of our lives, but also, in my view, radically changing the structure of our economy so that it's embedded in the ecology and the ecological biophysical limits of the planet, rather than this ecocidal, endless growth model that we have under capitalism, which to me is simply no longer scientifically credible. And in fact, where we do need economic growth is not in our societies in the global north. We're growed up enough. What we need is more redistribution of the available wealth and resources that have been created. Where we need growth is in the global south to lift people out of poverty. And of course, that's a big issue of the connection between climate and social justice. And I think maybe you could say the pandemic has, maybe it's missed this opportunity, but maybe it's still there as an echo or a resonance that, yes, the pandemic has forwarded this sense of a reckoning with these larger scale changes that we need. And maybe these cheap declarations of climate ecological emergency coming up against the reality of the pandemic, and also then saying this is then connected to the climate crisis. It's about, essentially, as I see it now, very simply, at this stage of the game, as it were, it's between an ideological commitment to continuing the status quo, capitalism and growth and so on, or physics. And I know which one I'm betting on in terms of, nature always bats last. So is that question of why aren't we seeing, the biophysical realities of what we are facing informing our policy? And of course, it's because of vested interest, convenience, the power of the status quo, and so on, which for me simply means that there is no non-political way out of this crisis. I'd also say there's no capitalist solution to this crisis. And as I say, there is a sense in which certainly our political and economic elites and in the media often, although it's, maybe not quite as prevalent in the media, but still very dominant, that somehow there's a plug and play version of the future that we simply kind of what I call biofuel the Hummer. So we take out the bad coal, oil, and gas, and we stick in clean, green energy. Whereas maybe it's the structure of the vehicle standing in here as a metaphor for the economy. Maybe that's the problem. We need to change the economy and not necessarily only look at the energy system as part of what we need to do in the decades ahead. And it's that question then that many of us asked who've been working on this for many years. So the government is acting on the epidemiological and medical evidence about the virus. So why isn't it acting on what the science has been saying for years? Where's the radical changes and the urgency of making these changes that climate science have been saying for decades now, and ever more stridently in the more recent years as we've not made the changes that are science-based? So we have these declarations, but then no action. And of course, that leads then to, whether it's the Greta Thunberg here has become kind of this icon of speaking truth to power, or, that like that Hans Christian Andersen fable of the emperor has no clothes, just calling it out, is that, we have the science. We don't need any more, even technological innovation, in my view, of all the technologies we need. But actually what is standing in the way now is a lazy, in my view, ideologically based view of holding on to the status quo. kind of greening growth, green capitalism, and so on. And, why is it, many of you have heard this phrase before, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I'm talking for functional reasons. It's simply a historical and very temporary and a very recent way of organizing our economies. It's now reached its limits of being safe and productive and adding more benefit than cost. Let's move on to something else beyond carbon, beyond capitalism, and beyond growth. But that's not what our political elite want to hear. They want to still try and keep on the business as usual track and using negative emissions technology, carbon capture and sequestration, and so on, which again, in my view, have no empirical scientific credibility. We cannot decouple an ever-growing capitalist economy from its negative climate and ecological impacts. What we need to do is to decouple a capitalist economy from human well-being if we're interested in decoupling. And then, of course, there is the issue that the pandemic shows early action saves lives. And in the climate and ecological space, that means the quicker we move, it's going to be cheaper. We make the changes now. You fix the roof when it's sunny, not when it's raining. And actually, we cannot have an unjust transition. We will not get the support of our communities if, for example, the 90% of the world's population that isn't in the top 10%, that isn't causing over 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, we have the evidence that the top 10% richest portion of the human population has the lion's share of the impact in terms of their lifestyle, using their wealth to have very high carbon and high ecologically damaging lifestyles. So if we are going to have a carbon tax, tax them, tax private jets, tax people with 3 and 4 holiday homes, or the forms of conspicuous carbon consumption that we know is the main cause of the climate crisis. So that issue of justice, because my fear is that if we don't have that justice-led approach, we will have more reactions like the Gilets jaunes movement in France in 2018, where a lot of working class people resisted the Macron government's imposition of a carbon tax on diesel because it was going to hurt them more than hurt the rich. Or in a different way, how the cultural war weaponizing of ultra low emission carbon zones by the Conservative Party in London is a harbinger of the need to bring people along with us in terms of having a justice-based response. Never mind that at the global level, whereby if the current draft COP agreement goes through, the Alliance of Small Island States like Kiribati and Tuvalu, they've said this is a death warrant for them. Why would they ever sign up to an agreement that means that they've locked in the eventual destruction of their society? So this justice-led approach, I think, absolutely has to be central to how we respond. And there's lots of possibilities that I think many of which we've lost, not all of them. The Building Back Better, or the Green New Deal, which, partly was very strong in America. There was echoes of it in Britain, but mostly under the Corbyn government. We've even seen Labour roll back on its commitments in terms of green investment. And I do think that this is a job-creating opportunity in terms of, I can see a new recession on the horizon. We already have a cost of living crisis, or as one of my colleagues calls it, it's a cost of profiteering crisis in terms of particularly fossil fuel companies making their most obscene profits in the last 2 years during the war in Ukraine. And this is the very substance that's the main cause of the climate crisis, causing people to, exist in fuel poverty and so on. And so how can we deal with a lot of problems in terms of inequality, creating jobs for our communities that are going to be needed in terms of nature restoration, providing, jobs in any Green New Deal, tackling, as I say, this particularly from where I am on the island of Ireland, of tackling energy poverty. But I think this is, the truth that other radical climate action group, Insulate Britain. Now, one may disagree with their tactics, but how can I disagree with what they're proposing? That every house in Britain, particularly the most energy leaky houses, should be, as a matter of priority, insulated to give people more money, reduce physical and mental health problems that they would have, and as a Brucey bonus, reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in terms of using less, even if they're using fossil fuels. We could also, have a cleaner, urban experience if we begin to see that it's active travel, public transportation, electric vehicles rather than internal combustion engine cars. And again, it's sad to see that the 2030 deadline that was given by the Conservative government about phasing out petrol and diesel cars has now been pushed back to 2035. And there's also then, as I mentioned, just in terms of potato issue here in Ireland, but we also have experience of where weather-related events in Spain and North Africa, never mind what happened in Ukraine in terms of disruption of nitrogen and the food that was being produced in grain, in particular wheat in the Ukraine. Energy security is also connected now to food security in many ways. And also then I think it's about seeing, and this is where it's partly ideological, but partly functional. I don't think we have any non-state-led response. We're going to have a welfare state response in terms of dealing with the climate and ecological crisis. Otherwise, we won't have any justice in it. And to me, it won't simply work. And then, just as an aside, I think we absolutely need to regulate the financial sector, because it is the finance sector, that's funding a lot of the fossil fuels that are causing the climate and ecological crisis. And of course, why we're all listening, I hope, to today's talk is the biggest existential threat our species ever faced in terms of the climate and biodiversity crisis. It's a big if. I'm under no illusion of how difficult it is, but the pandemic did give us an opportunity. I think it's largely been squandered, although we can talk about whether or not we still have a chance to recover some of that, of a green and just recovery and so on. But it's that question, can we begin to articulate in policy and politics of changing our economic system, which is the root cause of our climate and ecological crisis, rather than what's sometimes called capitalist realism, where most of us, certainly my students I teach, because they know nothing else, they can't even think outside the current economic paradigm. But we need that creative, imaginative, looking beyond our current economic system. And, I don't care what you call it. You can call it eco-socialism, social democracy. It doesn't really matter what the name of it is. But I do absolutely think that we're going to need to move beyond carbon, capitalism, and indeed growth as we create a more sustainable future. So I leave it there and happy to take any questions.
All right. So first of all, thank you very much, John, for that provocative talk. And I'd like to open up the questions to the audience in case anybody has any questions or comments. I'm going to repeat them for the online audience, so we have a clear sound. Who wants to make a start?
So I guess how can we as people and also academics make this more urgent than, I guess I'm coming from the viewpoint of if there already is so much activism and protests, how can we make governments feel that this is urgent? And yeah, I'm curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, so the question is, how can we as academics or as researchers or as people generally enforce the urgency of the situation to politics? How do we do this?
No, that's an excellent question. And in fact, I've just co-authored a paper earlier this year around the responsibility of academics and the academy in response to the planetary crisis. And essentially is that we cannot continue in a business as usual manner in terms of our research, our teaching, our outreach and engagement, our procurement, our professional practices, and some of which I was talking with Heiko and his colleagues there about what you're trying to do at Leicester in terms of, walking the talk around being a low carbon, climate resilient university. And I do think that and again, I say this with knowledge and awareness of how uneven privilege is distributed within the academy. It's easy for perhaps people like Heiko and myself who are senior members of the profession, secure, having the status and so on that goes along with that. I think it's for people like us to be stepping up and stepping out. And you do have examples of this, with Extinction Rebellion and the Scientist Rebellion, where a lot of scientists are now taking part directly in protest. They're doing really interesting things like pasting their peer-reviewed science on government buildings or fossil fuel corporations. I know that's not for everybody, that direct form of activism. And I do think, though, those of us who do have privilege in the academy, we need to be a lot more vocal. That can include getting involved in protests. It could also involve, just to be a bit more personal, of standing for elections. So I was 7 years a local government councillor here in Northern Ireland for the Green Party. And I do think that's another option for academics to try and enter into the political space directly. I also think, and again, it's something that's part of my professional practice now for the past 5 years, is taking every opportunity in the media to put across one's view in terms of what we need to do and you know, what the solutions and so on. And I do think we have to then also start looking at how we educate our students. And again, it's interesting that the discussion I was having with Heiko and his colleagues is similar to the one that we're having here at Queen's University, that we need to have a mandatory sustainability, climate, ecological module that all students should have to take regardless of their degree pathway, and ideally co-created with students, the Students' Union, and so on. Now, that's not directly influencing government, but we are influencing the future politicians or future voters in this issue. But I do think then we can also directly lobby our politicians and policymakers, and many of us do this in terms of our professional work would require us to, you know, give briefings to politicians or policymakers. But I do think there's a particular role for the academy, because we are, you know, the part of society that in a way has been entrusted to develop the analysis and the solutions to this existential threat we're facing. But it's not just a threat, it's a great opportunity. You know, and that's the other thing that I think we often forget. And in fact, I wasn't too, well, I did mention some of the positives about making this transition, but it's like that cartoon that many of us be familiar with, you know, the one where there's a climate scientist in a white coat standing up at a conference shouting and said, oh, but what if climate change is a hoax and we create a better world for nothing? It's to flip the narrative that somehow it's about what we're losing. And it is what we can gain in terms of, yes, there are much different lives. I think my own view, we are going to have to selectively deglobalize. We're going to have to, you know, increase the resilience of our food and energy security. And that would be enhanced by having food and energy being produced more locally as possible. I think it will require then, in my own view, because I'm a post-growth economist, about moving beyond GDP is the only metric that we measure the success of our economy, looking at things like universal basic income, universal basic services, but also then, you know, what about a 3 or 4 day working week? And in all of those proposals, I think we have the academic evidence, and not everybody will agree with me, of course, that's absolutely fine. That's the essence of academic freedom. But we can use in those horizon scanning policies to influence politics and our politicians, as I say, through some of the mechanisms I've mentioned there already. But I've decided that I'm going to devote the remaining part of my career in terms of looking at how can the university and the academic system itself be fit for future purpose. Because at the moment, we're not. I think we're part of the problem, the way we're organized. And that if the world is on fire, you know, how can we behave in a business as usual manner? Never mind the fact that many of us are not just academics, we're parents, we're citizens. So it does seem to me that we're now facing an extraordinary moment in human history whereby we have to absolutely accept that we need to move beyond business as usual. But the problem is there's no blueprint or green print. This really is a case of making the path as we walk.
Thank you, John. I just want to add to this that, first of all, we are also thinking about how we can improve the way we work together with politics, with government departments, with the devolved administrations in a better way through the university. And also the University of Leicester is just setting up a new policy institute, which is chaired by my colleague, Professor Neil Chakraborty. That was announced in November last year and is about to become operational. So watch this space and get in touch with the Politics Institute, with the Policy Institute in the University of Leicester, because actually that can also be a mechanism for getting involved more on the political impact of the research that we do. I think we have reached the end of our time, so I'd like to just thank you again, John, for giving us that presentation today and for the discussion. Have a good day, and thank you very much, Professor John Berry.
Thanks, colleagues. Take care.
All the best.
Bye-bye. Take care, Heiko. Keep in touch.